We're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our March Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force meeting. We have a great agenda for you today, but before we dive into our presentations, I do want to touch on a few policy updates. And I say I, but most of them are going to come from Caitlin Snyder, who is also in the room with me, and Ethan Handelman is here as well. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Caitlin to start us with some policy updates.
Thanks, Rebecca. So my first update is around appropriations. So government funding for fiscal year 17 will expire on April 28th. And for funding for the remainder of the fiscal year, and that goes through September of this year, it could either be a continuing resolution where they take last year's numbers and use them again for this year, or rolled into some kind of minibus or omnibus package. House Appropriations Committee Chairman Rodney Frelinghuysen of New Jersey has said that a standalone fiscal year 2017 defense spending bill, and that he has commitment from the leadership to move all other 10 fiscal bills to the floor. So THUD would be included in those. That's going to take a lot of work to make that happen, so we might see a continuing resolution, but to hear the Appropriations Committee Chairman say that is a pretty big indicator, and it's a positive thing. As we've mentioned before on these calls, a continuing resolution for housing programs is particularly challenging because rents across the country are going up, and that requires increased spending levels for housing programs. For fiscal year 2017, HUD needs approximately $1.8 billion more than fiscal year 16 spending levels, and USDA needs an additional $18.75 million more. And those are just to maintain current levels and renew existing housing assistance contracts. That's kind of FY17 in a nutshell. And then for FY18, we've heard today that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is interested in striking a deal to lift the budget cap set by sequestration. That's the first we've heard from that high of a leadership level. And on Monday, the White House and OMB Director Mick Mulvaney said that they're looking to increase defense spending by $54 billion and decrease non-defense discretionary funding by the same amount. And non-defense discretionary funding is where the THUD bill lives. So over the next 2 weeks, agencies will be submitting budget proposals with cuts totaling $54 billion. And Mulvaney also said that top-line agency numbers should be available in mid-March, so hopefully, I think he said March 16th, we'll have an idea of what HUD's number is, and then we'll see a full budget in May. And these are all estimates coming from Mick Mulvaney, so hopefully they're reliable. And then the last thing I'll say on appropriations is that a number of prominent Republicans have voiced their concerns with the president's budget. Representative Charlie Dent of Pennsylvania, who's on the THUD Appropriations Committee, said the president will propose and the Congress will dispose, indicating that they have the purse strings. And there's been quite a few other quotes from prominent Republicans. So as a way to get involved with appropriations, I want to make you aware of two things. So the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding has a sign-on letter asking for the highest allocation for transportation and HUD funding as possible. And we're encouraging everyone to sign on to that letter and share it with your network so that we can really show the broad support that these programs have. And then next Monday, March 6th at 3 p.m., the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding is hosting a webinar on President Trump's first budget and how it could impact affordable housing. And they're also releasing a new report on that webinar, A Place to Call Home, the case for increased federal investments in affordable housing. So it's kind of appropriations, and then I wanted to make you all aware of something we learned around the HUD Secretary. So this morning, the Senate held a procedural vote advancing the confirmation of HUD Secretary nominee Dr. Carson. And we expect to see a final confirmation in the next couple of days. So keep your eyes out for a final vote.
Thanks, Caitlin. And related to cabinet leadership, many other of President Trump's nominees have moved forward and been confirmed, including Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, Representative Tom Price, now the Secretary of Health and Human Services, as well as Stephen Mnuchin, Secretary of Treasury, David Shulkin, the Secretary of Veteran Affairs, Nick Mulvaney, now OMB Director, and EPA Secretary Scott Pruitt. So all of those confirmations have been moved forward, are completed, and they are now running their cabinet agencies. So wanted to make sure you were aware of all of that. The last thing I wanted to touch on is just to make sure everyone's aware of a bill that was introduced by Senator Mike Lee from Utah and Representative Gosar from Arizona, called the Local Zoning Decisions Protection Act. The bill would nullify HUD's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule and prohibit the use of federal funds for federal database geospatial information on community racial disparities or disparities in access to affordable housing. So to make that a little bit easier to understand is mapping where amenities are, where housing is, where concentrations of race is, to see impacts of different investments, and that would be incredibly damaging. So NHC has written a letter expressing our concerns with the bill, and it's on our website. I encourage you to take a look at it and think about how you might want to engage, and we're going to be following the bill and let you know how things progress or hopefully don't progress. But just wanted to give you that update. Before we dive into our presentations, a couple of NHC updates. We have just opened up our gala, our annual gala or housing prom, and tickets can be purchased. So we hope that many of you will join us on June 8th. And we also have a webinar coming up on March 14th on our Paycheck to Paycheck More Than Housing Supplement, which is looking at how housing costs impact or kind of play a role in a total household budget. So the other things like food and education and how housing fits together with that. So we will include all that information in the follow-up email from today's meeting, but encourage you to check that out. So as I mentioned, we have a great agenda for you, two really valuable presentations. We're going to start with Michael Wadakin, who is the president of the National Housing Trust, and he's going to talk to us about their High Opportunity Strategy pilot. So give us a quick second to get that teed up. Michael, are you with us?
I am with you.
Perfect.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to talk about NHT's High Opportunity Strategy. I think probably to level set all of this, a number of us, and probably many people on this phone call, have been part of an ongoing dialogue between what I will call the fair housing community, broadly written, and housing community developers in many states and national developers in particular. Certainly the Trust was very much involved in that, as well as NHC. And that was a good discussion, a good dialogue. But over time, at least for the Trust, we felt like it was important to not only talk about how we could work together with our fair housing colleagues, but use our real estate platform as a means to actually do something that perhaps hadn't been done by others in this area. So let me try to set the stage for that. Obviously, one of the tensions that exists, or one of the issues that exists in providing housing for those poor households who are currently in segregated areas, is to develop or preserve housing in areas of what are called, and I use this in quotes, high opportunity neighborhoods. Now, let me just quickly say that 90% of what the Trust does is not in that high opportunity areas. We usually stabilize housing in areas of lower opportunity, but that is done because we believe that people should be able to restore their own neighborhoods. They should be able to revitalize housing where they live. But there is a certain argument, certainly by Raj Chetty and others, that demonstrates that over time, people who reside, especially kids, who reside in so-called high opportunity neighborhoods actually have better life outcomes. So if you take that as a given, which I do, then certainly the Trust should have at least a strategy for trying to figure out a way to use our resources and our real estate strategies to try to develop something in high opportunity areas? Well, one could go after 9% credits and build new affordable housing in such areas, but one would quickly run into a strong NIMBY reaction in those areas. Or one could try to focus on HUD subsidized housing that's located in areas near good schools, but you would find the price of that housing is significant and you would be competing. So we decided to adopt a third strategy, and that third strategy is in certain places, and I'll talk about that in a second, we believe that we could buy existing market rate housing proximate to good schools, schools ranked higher than 7 on the Great Schools Index, and work with housing authorities in those locations. And those locations so far have been Minneapolis, the greater Chicago area, Montgomery County and Baltimore, Hartford and West Hartford, Connecticut, and certain places in New Jersey, so 5 different places, with fair housing colleagues on the ground and with developers on the ground, and compete for market rate properties that currently do not accept vouchers. And we would, using our own equity, an equity that we have from our partnership with the Housing Partnership Equity Trust and our own line of credit, compete for such properties, and over time create a mixed income property in these areas so that kids who currently are not have good schools in which they can attend and who want to move to such areas could move in over time. And that's the basic idea. We came up with this idea about 2 years ago. We've been working on it about 2 years. We have one property. It's been very difficult to get going because, as like many of you, most of our deals are tax credit deals. We have a portfolio of properties of about 4,000 units that we have to maintain. And it was not something that was easy for our housing developers to grab onto. But what we did do is, for the first year, we basically created partnerships in the places, and I'll repeat them: Minneapolis, greater Chicago area, Montgomery County in Maryland, and Baltimore County, Maryland, parts of New Jersey, and in Hartford and West Hartford, Connecticut, with both housing authorities and fair housing colleagues on the ground. And then the second year was devoted to trying. We actually hired someone almost full time, and all she's doing right now is devoting her time to try to find acquisitions in this space. And it's been a really interesting and dynamic engagement, in that it's totally outside of the discussions we typically have about federal appropriations. It's totally outside the discussions about whether or not there should be a furthering fair housing rule. It's really using our own strength and our own what we're good at, and trying to figure out a way to change people's lives in certain places. It's not a scaled solution of 1,000 units or 10,000 units. We'd like to have 1,000 units in these locations over 5 years. That's kind of our goal. So far we have 74 in 2 years, so we're behind. We need to do more. We're bidding on properties with private parties in these locations. We just missed out on a 5-property portfolio in near West Hartford, Connecticut, which has the best scoring schools in Connecticut, very close, and we're getting better at this. It's a different discipline. It requires one to kind of focus on market rate properties, assuming you can do a 7-year exit over time with your own equity. But it's been interesting. We've developed new partners, energy efficiency partners up in Connecticut and in Minneapolis, who believe they can bring energy efficiency resources to these properties. So I want to make sure we have time for comments, but that's basically the idea. I hope you have. I think you have a one-pager in front of you, and we're happy to send that out to you once we have it. Eligible properties are anything from 50 to 150 units. We were starting, and eligible partners are people like those on this phone call who think they have the ability to possibly help us with gap financing on the ground, who want to be local partners of some kind. One issue that we're confronting in Hartford is making sure that our partner, Open Communities Alliance, has the ability to counsel people as they make the shift to these market rate properties. So we're very excited about it. It's a very different kind of solution. It's not based on programmatic funding as much as it's a concept. And again, I think it's something that would be maybe useful for you all to think about in your neighborhoods. I'm going to stop for a second to make sure that we have time for questions, but I want to make sure that I covered what you needed. Rebecca, do you need any more from me, or should we ask for questions? Actually, why don't I do this? You'll also notice that we have Ann Owens from Southern California, who is going to do some kind of a study downstream once we have a critical mass of units under our belt, studying how the kids did both before and after they came to these properties. So I'll leave it at that. I'm interested in people's feedback.
Thanks, Michael. We definitely want to have some discussion. Folks, remember, you can always send questions through the question box, but we'll start with some questions here in the room.
I get to go first. Hey, Michael, it's Ethan. Thank you for a succinct but detailed description of what you've been doing. One thing that occurred to me, and you alluded to this some, but it might warrant some more detail, is the real differences in the transaction environment between, you know, a preservation deal with tax credits and maybe Section 8 contract, or, you know, other resources that has a whole lot of process around it, versus a market rate acquisition transaction. Can you tell folks, you know, some of what the differences are in that environment?
Sure, and let me just say that I should have covered that in more detail. Thank you for the question. So they really are different disciplines. And so for those of you, and certainly we didn't have a lot of experience, we had some experience buying market rate properties, but certainly hadn't devoted a lot of detail to it. The big difference here, in both environments, you're probably competing for properties that are being brokered, and you need to provide, you know, for the seller, ability to execute. In both environments, you have to prepare packages and deal with the seller's concern about your ability to get financing. What's dramatically different in the market rate scenario is here you're given a very short period of time to put real money on the ground and make a judgment. And because these properties are located in higher, quote, higher opportunity areas near good schools and they're market rate, you need to really change your assumptions about rehab, about management. It's a very different business. So by way of example, we're not managing these properties. We have third-party managers. And we don't assume significant rehab. Because if you, I mean, the ones that we're looking at in Montgomery County right now are nicer than my home. I mean, they're beautiful properties. So, and that's not atypical. These are properties that are very nice properties. And remember, they've been, and you're competing against market players who are going to sell those properties. They're going to bid them up. They're going to try to maximize rents, and then they're going to try to lay them off. And because they're near good schools, they do get attractive offers. What we have that they don't is we have relatively lower cost of equity returns, and we're hoping to compete, and we've come close, as I mentioned in this prompt, and we're getting better at it. The second, third thing I would say is in terms of presentation, the amount of time and trouble we put into these presentations and our proposals is, it's funny, the underwriting is actually not as rigorous. It's rigorous, but it's pretty straightforward. What we hadn't done before was putting together what we've done, you know, just basically kind of high gloss materials, I'll say, that get your attention, and marketing. And so you save a lot of time. So on a tax credit deal, you're spending a ton of time you're paying someone a ton of time to do a tax credit deal. It's going to take a long time. You're going to wait for a long time to get everything. It could take 2 or 3 years, maybe more. These deals are going to close in less than 6 months, and they're going to close with traditional financing in your own equity. The deal in Hartford closed in 4 months, and it could be that you're going to hold on to it and maybe down the line do possibly a 4% deal. But remember, that's not the objective. The objective is just to simply use it as a cash flowing property with up to 20%, and you have to make sure that the housing authority rents meet the market rents. And that, in our cases, that was one of the crucial issues for us, was making sure we were working with housing authorities who could pay market rate rents with the Section 8 voucher. So in some ways it's easier to think about, but it's not the way that affordable housing developers maybe have learned their business. It's not, on one side it requires faster execution. On the other, it's not quite as 12 sources of financing you have to mind meld in to a cake that everybody can agree to.
Well, exactly. I think that's a really important difference, and I think it's great that you're demonstrating to others how to, I guess, stretch different muscles.
And you would be surprised at how much the housing authorities really appreciate. It's been one of the clients we really like is the housing authorities have been really excited about this because nobody's really thought about it from their perspective. And from their perspective, they want to do this. They, whether they have a legal obligation or not, they'd like to have the opportunity to put vouchers in these neighborhoods, and they just haven't ever figured it out. So West Hartford is actually going to be working with us on this first 74-unit deal, and we're now doing we're trying to do another deal with them. So it's opened up some ideas for us that we wouldn't have otherwise pursued.
So last question from me, and then I suspect we have questions from others. Are you finding in any of these jurisdictions that because you're a mission-oriented nonprofit owner that you have, say, real estate tax breaks or other things that help you beyond the inexpensive equity from the trust?
Again, great question. So in some jurisdictions, Montgomery County, Hartford, I don't think New Jersey, in at least 2 of the places we're located, if it's a nonprofit-owned property or a property shared with a housing authority, there's not total forgiveness, but there's a payment in lieu of taxes. And it's a negotiated amount, less than what a market rate developer might have to pay.
Great.
We do have a question from one of our attendees, Michael, about who, and you alluded to this, but who owns the property and if the vouchers are tenant or project-based and how the process works for getting tenants in there and certified.
Great questions, both good. So NHT Enterprise, which is our joint venture with Enterprise to own multifamily properties, will be the controlling owner. In Hartford, we actually are giving a piece of it to the housing authority, and we would be open to those kinds of partnerships. In Montgomery County, we're talking about working with the Housing Opportunities Commission and joint ownership. In Chicago, we're actually working with a for-profit organization, which is trying to find properties for us. And in that location, it doesn't appear that property tax or the ownership matters. We want to be able to do it. My guess is using our own equity, their equity is much more expensive, their equity returns, so it depends. We'll have to work that out. So I think it depends on the market. In Minnesota, we've decided to work with Common Bond, who many of you might know. They're a great nonprofit, and my guess is they would want control, and we would cede that to them. So it depends on the market. Was there another question embedded in there?
For the vouchers, are they tenant or project-based?
Well, this is very fascinating. We always assumed they would be project-based. And we kind of whiffed this, and this is, for those of you who are going to do this, one of the issues that comes with project-based with housing authorities is often they can't set them aside. They often have to do RFPs, or they can do them easier in a new construction deal where they are part of the financing. Here, remember, you're buying a property, and when you buy the property, the date you close, there's no affordability in that property. It's really hard for a housing authority to then project base a unit at a time as you bring tenants into them. Even if over time you're going to have 20%, which would be perfect for project basing, it's not part of your financing because by definition, you don't know when the tenants are going to move in. And so you can't really include project-based vouchers in your financing, in your acquisition financing. So what we've been doing is we've been going to basically regular vouchers. In some cases, the vouchers can be increased to the market because of the places we're going to meet the market rents. And the housing authority has people on their waiting list, and our fair housing colleagues will essentially certify the tenants as they move in. And that's the theory. So in each of these cases, we've received small grants to help our fair housing colleagues on the ground. We pass through those grants for this purpose so they can do that work for us. There was a lot of question about whether people would want to move into these properties, and I can say that is not an issue. You have enough people on waiting lists in these locations who want to at least try to move to these higher opportunity neighborhoods that there will be a demand for it.
Has there been any concern in terms of market rate tenants and the trajectory into a mixed income community?
I think there is, but remember this is not going to be 20% day one. We anticipate it being 20% say over 3 years. We're not going to do every unit that comes open a voucher. We've been talking to market rate property firms, and they think if you just take your time and do it over time and demonstrate that it won't upset the market. This is especially true, of course, in areas that have significant demand for rental housing. And because we are going to be self-imposing somewhat of a limit on our rent hikes based on using our own equity, we think we'll be competitive in the regular market, more than competitive.
Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting and fascinating for us here in the room, and I'm sure for folks online. I think with that, we will close it out unless there's any lingering questions, and we will shift to our next presentation. But thank you so much, Michael, for joining us and sharing this with us.
Well, and Rebecca, before we move on, the one-pager that Michael referenced and the recording of this will all be shared with the larger list, right?
Yes.
Okay.
That would be great. And I appreciate the time to talk to everyone today.
No, thanks for doing it, Michael.
Okay, with that, we are going to move into our next presentation, which is from Rhode Island Housing. We have Barbara Fields, who's the Executive Director of Rhode Island Housing, and we have Kyle Bennett, who's the Director of Public Policy and Research for United Way of Rhode Island. They're going to talk to us about their Yes on 7 campaign, which was a statewide ballot measure, for a $50 million bond for affordable housing that was passed this past election in November. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Rhode Island and let them share with us.
Okay, we're just trying to get the presentation up on our screen. I hope everybody can see it. This is Barbara Fields. Good afternoon.
Yes, it looks great, Barbara.
Okay, thanks for inviting us. I'm joined by my colleague Kyle Bennett from United Way, and we will quickly run through the Yes on 7 campaign that we had here in 2016 and talk about a little bit the history, how the campaign worked, and what we need to do next. But I also just wanted to start, I thought that was a really interesting presentation by Michael, and thank you for that, and I look forward to hearing how that works. I was the one who was typing in questions. I had about 6 more, but I think it's really interesting that we have to always try new models, so thank you for asking and inviting him. So in the state of Rhode Island, we have very, very little state money put into housing, and so we have in the past gone to the bond route. And I was around in 2006 running the local LISC office when we got on the bond, the first ballot passed by the legislature, approved by the governor, and on the ballot. Ballot initiatives in our state can only go on in a general election year. So in 2006, we passed a $50 million bond that was used for, we've used our bonds for 3 buckets of housing. We've built family rental housing, some of that using LIHTC, or a lot of that, not always. Some of it looking to help a little deeper subsidy to get to supportive housing, and then a smaller piece for home ownership. We saw in 2006, obviously, rapidly rising housing costs and the housing shortage. Clearly that changed. There was the recession, but in 2012, another bond was put on, this time at $25 million. And between the 2 bonds, in which we funded, you can see the number of units up here. Rhode Island Housing was the underwriter for a statewide policy board called the Housing Resources Commission. We reviewed 453 applications between those 2 bonds. So you can see how, at least, I don't have the numbers of units that were applied for, but certainly the number of applications would show you and give you an indication about the demands across the state. So the state of Rhode Island, yes, we are the smallest state in the country, but we do have 1 million people, so by population we're not. In many ways, our market is increasingly, I would say, becoming almost, in some ways, caught in the Boston market, in that there are many people that commute from Rhode Island to Massachusetts on the train about an hour, and so that has actually had an interesting impact, perhaps more so than ever in the last decade. So leading up to the 2016 campaign, we undertook a study at Rhode Island Housing that hadn't been done to look at current conditions and to project out 10 years. We worked with Housing Works Rhode Island, which is a policy and research organization currently now based at Roger Williams University, and we used a group many of you may know, Mark Drayson's group. Metropolitan Area Planning Council was a subcontractor helping us do projections. So the state of Rhode Island was projected to grow anywhere from 3 to 5% over the next 10 years. The rest of the country is projected to grow about 8%. New England's growing a little slower. So we did 2 different scenarios, but using that and looking at the demand, we projected we would need 35,000 to 40,000 new homes to meet the demand in the next decade, which is about 3,000 units a year, which we were doing in the 80s and pretty much even into the 90s, but we are well below that. Actually, for 6 years running, the state of Rhode Island on a per capita basis was pulling building permits. We were the lowest in the country. So we really have had almost next to nothing going on in the private market, and the numbers kept up somewhat by the nonprofits and some of the LIHTC deals. So what we saw in the next 10 years is reflective of what you see around the country. I did hear Chris Hebert give a report last summer. It's very similar. We will see growth in millennials and growth in seniors in this state particularly, because as jobs were lost, we suffered in Rhode Island worse than the rest of New England, one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. We lost a group of people. I always joke, we lost 35,000 children, and not like my teenagers who'd like to get lost from me. It was younger children moving with their parents who were looking for work. And so we see a wave in our population growth. We'll see millennials grow over the next 10 years. Those that we lost will be a slight downturn, and then we have seniors, the 65 plus, growing. And what's that impact on our market is that we will see most households that we need to house earning below 120% of area median income. And what we also saw is we saw across the board on the rental side increased housing cost burden. No surprise in the lower income categories, but even families earning over $60,000 a year, we actually saw a 140% increase in the numbers who were housing cost burdened by the national standards. This slide, the next one, is perhaps my favorite because I think it shows in stark contrast. A lot of our legislators would say to us, oh, don't compare us to Massachusetts, they're rich. I said, okay, let's look at Vermont and Maine. New Hampshire is not on here, not because we don't love them, but because they don't have a state income tax. So this puts us in perspective for New England, that not only were we the lowest in state investment in housing and homeless programs, we actually went in the wrong direction in 16 and 17. And it is the bond that we just passed will help move us, but we're really still not seeing the types of programs at the state level that we find in our neighboring states, making it difficult to produce housing, and particularly even more so difficult to reach those at the lowest end of the income spectrum. So the work to get on the bond, this started as something that the advocates were pursuing and the Housing Resources Commission. It was introduced in legislation, but unlike the other two bonds, this bond actually appeared in our governor's budget. I will say we asked for $100 million, and she put it in her budget at $40 million, in part due to a cap on bond authorization that the state treasurer was laying out, but due to some good advocacy, the final amount that went onto the ballot was for $50 million. But we were very pleased to have both the legislative and executive branch endorsing this early on as something that would be smart for economic development in the state of Rhode Island. So we're going to talk a little bit about planning for the campaign. I'll let Kyle talk about it, because in the first two bonding rounds, Rhode Island Housing actually made a financial contribution to the campaign, but different times, different administration, different lawyers, and we were told that we were not eligible to put money in, although we could work on it, be part of commissions. And I will talk later about many of the ribbon cuttings and events I did, but financially we needed to find another leader to run the campaign.
Hello, this is Kyle. At that point, where Barbara left off after the ballot item had been decided on, United Way joined the campaign with a group of advocates consisting of Rhode Island Housing and several others who had worked diligently over the previous year to ensure that we did have a ballot campaign. United Way was part of the team with Rhode Island Housing and another local foundation that led the previous two bond campaigns. So it was only natural that we would join, yet I think the sense of fatigue on the part of United Way Board of Directors and administration didn't lend itself to readily joining the crew. But I think there was a point in time where we thought it may not happen if we didn't, so we decided to not only sign on, but to then invest $100,000 in the campaign. And I'll say that to not toot our own horn, but to say that in the third bond, or this 2016 bond campaign, we ran a lean and mean, financially lean and mean campaign, where we had about a third of what was raised previously to operate the campaign, and set a goal of raising $150,000 in total. So while United Way added $100,000, the advocates raised an additional $58,000 to support the campaign. And we did that in a number of ways. But I'll tell you a little bit more about why we joined. We have a helpline at United Way called 211, and many of you may have 211, a helpline in your state. Each year we receive about 200,000 calls. In the past year, in 2015, United Way receives over 60,000 calls specifically related to housing.
And I wanted to jump in and say that at Rhode Island Housing, we receive an additional 4,000 calls a month. So over 40,000 calls a year. I would say about 65% of those looking for housing assistance. We obviously do get calls around people with home ownership opportunities and foreclosure prevention issues, perhaps.
So we recognize that those numbers are large, but the challenge is that they're continuing to grow. So I think United Way leadership said this is a perfect opportunity for us to come in and not only work on the short term, but then to stay in partnership with Rhode Island Housing moving forward to continue the long game of restructuring housing investment here in the state and increasing that number, as we saw in the previous slide. So the campaign was set up primarily with the steering committee. The members are listed as you see. We hired a contracting consultant in a campaign manager and a public relations company to help us move the work in a way that a professional lobbying and advocacy organization would do. And we thought this was important because we knew that we had less dollars to spread and we didn't want to waste. And something that came through the leadership and ultimate wisdom of the campaign manager and public relations committee was that we decided to target likely voters. So we were going to run a campaign that did not include television for the first time. We relied more on earned media in the newspaper or public media spaces than we did on paid media. And we used a significant portion, almost $10,000 of our campaign account to drive Facebook ads and Twitter ads. And through the use of Facebook and Twitter, we were able to see voters in a different light. The amount of information that Twitter and Facebook have, respectively, on your electorate is amazing. So we targeted not only folks who voted in the 2016 and 2006 and 2012 elections for the bond, but also those who voted in the 3 previous bonds and those who were likely to vote for the housing bond as they had previously. And then we looked at cities and towns, so we began to break down the campaign results from the 2 previous bonds to see which towns were in favor of the bond and which were opposed. And just before the election, about 1 month prior, we sent out a poll asking some of the questions that you see above. Our campaign manager was telling us that there was something happening this year that I think we all noticed and referred to as the Trump factor. This year we saw people post-election who returned to the campaign electorate and re-engaged in the voting process that may not have been involved in the last 10, 12, or even 20 years. But we also saw folks who were younger, who were newly engaged in the electoral process, feeling disconnected. And for Rhode Island, the vote, it was a pretty clear split down the center of our state in terms of those who were in favor of the campaign and those who were opposed. But leading up to that point, as Barbara mentioned earlier, we did begin to run several events, and we thought it was important to connect directly with folks who would be involved in the campaign moving forward. Those people we identified were builders, funders, elected officials, residents, and community development corporations. So we attended over 25 rallies. Barbara was part of every single groundbreaking, and I believe she has a golden shovel to prove it and a helmet. But we also thought it was important to reach out to organizations that may not be as inclined to support the campaign and really help to educate them on what affordable housing and this particular bond and its reference to affordable housing meant. So we spoke to the likely groups, the Chambers of Commerce, the Economic Impact Forum, and downtown improvement districts, but we also went to places that neighbors gathered, that ordinary Rhode Islanders would gather and could hear the message in the same light. And one of them is called the Pachaka-Cha. That's a local event that really helps to promote creativity and innovation in a community-based sense. But I'll tell you what, that was probably one of the more receptive audiences to, actually Barbara and I were both at that presentation, to the idea of building housing that could not only afford folks who were traditional in terms of Rhode Islanders who grew up every day, but those folks who came to Rhode Island to go to college, who have graduated, who are now burdened with student loan debt, but also looking for a place that they can afford to live without being cost burdened. And I think that was an awesome opportunity for us. So as you can see, we've used several forms of marketing materials. We went old school with hand cards, palm cards. We had lawn signs and T-shirts. But the majority of our effort was really spent in a digital format and connecting with folks online. So, as I mentioned earlier, our social media ad boost was $10,000. And for anybody who works in the marketing or advertising field, you'll know that that's just pennies in a bucket in terms of an overall strategy. But I'll tell you, with that $10,000, we were able to increase our market share significantly. We reached over 600,000 people or independent views through our Facebook ads alone. With the state the size of 1 million people, that's pretty significant. In addition to that, our ad buys on the radio helped us to move our agenda forward. 1 in 2 Rhode Islanders, 2 out of 3 Rhode Islanders, pardon me, heard our ad on the radio at least one time in the course of a 3-week period prior to the election. We think that helped to, again, reach out to the likely voters, but also to support those and help to change the minds of others who may have been on the fence. Moving forward, our strategy really, as I mentioned, focused on local media, statewide media, and again, using the earned media through all of our outlets really was helpful for us.
There were several other ballot initiatives in the state, and so if a local newspaper was covering the other ballots, we were able to get extra coverage there. The other ballots dealing with some economic development investments. And I think on this endorsements, I think some of the ones that are sort of the usual suspects, but we did get the Chamber of Commerce, the Growth Smart, which is our local smart growth group, in support of the Board of Rabbis, and we had also been told that the AFL-CIO and the unions would not endorse this because lots of our deals are done without Davis-Bacon wages, but we went and met with them, and the first thing they did is they stood up and said, we want to clarify, we support this because our guys are finally busy again, so we know this is really going to a lot of the smaller shops, and we're backing it, and they got their membership to endorse and back this, which was a really big, I think, win for the campaign.
Absolutely.
Roseanne.
Lastly, I'll say that we, in targeting likely voters and likely communities, we used a number of strategies, and one of them was to organize the Get Out the Vote. Through this door-knocking campaign, we were able to talk to folks in the communities that voted in not only in the highest percentage, but the highest percentage in favor of the two previous bonds. And you'll see just a few photos here, but what we heard was overwhelmingly in support of the bond. And we found that where there were challenges, they weren't necessarily challenges with the bond itself, it was with the understanding or the interpretation of affordable housing. So it was a great opportunity for us to really connect with the electorate. And as you can see from this slide, the vote, it's almost 50-50 in terms of the number of communities that were in support versus those who were in opposition. So having the strategy of reaching out to the communities that were likely to vote, the voters who were likely to vote, and those communities that voted in the greatest number really benefited us. With an approval margin of 58%, we say that we've won. Now, that's not an overwhelming show of support. However, in this election, given the Trump factor, given the concern with the cap on bonds for the entire state, and then seeing a 58% victory, we call that an overwhelming victory. And we know that there's more work to do, as we mentioned, moving forward. But that says that there are more people in Rhode Island, clearly, that are interested in building affordable housing in their communities than there are who are not.
So the next steps for the bond now are that to actually get the money and put it out. The $40 million will be run through the Housing Resources Commission and will be focused on the three buckets that I mentioned earlier: home ownership, rental housing, and supportive housing, not necessarily equal buckets. And the $10 million could go to housing, but it could also be remediation of blighted community properties that are in tremendous need of upgrade and that serve a low and moderate income communities. I think you will notice throughout the materials that Kyle showed, you don't see the word affordable, and I would say it was a very conscientious choice to not use that in this state. Marketing and testing of the market showed that that would not win us any hearts and minds, so we focused on housing opportunity, those two words, and we tried as much as possible to do a lot of pictures because I think people still conjure up images, as we all know. So we really tried to show the variety of types of investments that have been made in the last decade, and there's still a lot of surprises that people go, oh, I live near that, I had no idea, and that's exactly obviously what we want. But we had to constantly pound away, and I do think social media played a tremendous role. We definitely did outreach to the Millennial Professional Group, and they definitely provided help and as well as supporting it. So I think particularly our study showed that those graduating Rhode Island-based universities would come out with an average of $32,000 in student debt, and they are feeling the squeeze. In the second quarter of 2016, the state of Rhode Island had the lowest rental vacancy rate in the country, according to the Federal Reserve Bank. So I know it keeps changing a little bit each time, but we really, because we've had such a lack of construction, the rental market particularly tight, I think really played big with a lot of people in getting this passed. We expect to promulgate the regs and have public hearings this spring and have the money out for RFP by late spring, and hopefully not miss the entire construction season with the first piece. The $40 million will probably go out at about $10 or $12 million a year. So we're open for questions. It's a lot of information.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. It was a lot of information, but it was really interesting and helpful information. And we do have questions, and thank you for being willing to entertain them. And one is, I'm going to phrase it a little differently, but in terms of the development you're planning or hoping with this bond, are you envisioning mostly new construction or acquiring existing properties for rehab or a mix?
Yes.
What kind of
in Rhode Island, and from what we do both. And I think that we will see there will be a lot of a lot of rehabilitation of existing structures. We have a lot of historical structures in the state, a lot of old mill buildings. A lot of infill is needed in some of our communities, so we will see new construction at times that will infill in between. We do have the 4th oldest housing stock in the country, and if you just look at our rental stock, it is the oldest rental stock in the country. So whatever work gets done on rehab will also include tremendous focus on energy upgrades and retrofitting and bringing to current standards. And Rhode Island Housing is just going to start in 2 weeks our first full-time energy person who will work across our entire footprint as opposed to being part of a lot of people's jobs. It's a very big issue and high on our agenda. So we will see all. And we will see rental, and I hope we get a robust number of home ownership proposals because the market is getting increasingly tight too. We haven't seen as much in that area in the 2012 bond, but we hope that this new bond would bring in a few more home ownership proposals. The bulk will be rental.
Barbara, this is Ethan. Thank you. I'll echo Rebecca's thanks. And it's exciting to hear that you have an energy person coming on staff. We should make sure they learn about our Green Affordable Housing Coalition, which not only will have resources for them, but would probably benefit from their expertise.
Great, absolutely.
I have an interesting question from our previous presenter around how using social media campaigns like Yes on 7 could be used more generally to generate support for federal housing programs like LIHTC or in specific congressional districts or U.S. senators in Rhode Island, for example. Just wondering if you guys have given thought to that, and we can we'll let
It's a very interesting question. Very interesting question, and I think about this a lot. My communications person is in the room. I think one of the things we tried to talk about is when we would go out to these events, we would say, okay, everybody whip out your phone. I mean, really at a groundbreaking with 60 people. And we'd say, okay, who doesn't have Twitter? We would help them get on, but we would also encourage them not just to put up about this, but we would say, have you followed Senator Reid and Senator Whitehouse? And can you retweet their stuff? And so I think the electeds really like that if you're, positively supporting them. And we happen to have a great delegation in Rhode Island. We only have 4, 2 and 2. I think in general, they've been very supportive of the housing agenda, super supportive, obviously, Senator Reid. But I think when you retweet them, they notice that. And so we were not only saying people follow Yes on 7, we were actually asking them, can you also support some of our electeds and tweet their stuff when you think it's good, when they've been at a groundbreaking or a ribbon cutting with us? And I think that really sparked a lot more support. And also, I think, feeds into getting the delegation to stay focused on our issue. Because they all have Twitter accounts. I have 200 employees at Rhode Island Housing. We're still trying to get everybody up on Twitter. I mean, really trying to get people to say this is definitely a way for information to be shared and our agenda to be out there. And on our Twitter account, I always like to try and put a photo or link to a photo because, again, I think we're a very visual society, and people should see who we're housing, where we're housing them, and what it looks like. And it's not, so it's not abstract at all.
Barbara, this is Chris Estes. Question on sort of what you all, if you had a sort of negative frame that you had to overcome, and was there a particular message or confusion or sort of common kind of challenge you had to face from folks, either saying like, you know, is this public housing, is this that slum stuff I see in my neighborhood, or you know, what was there a thing, a sort of message or a frame that you all had to particularly consistently respond to in this effort?
Kyle can jump in too, but you know, Chris, I like to just stay in my bubble if people support it. But no, I really did try, and I think, be hard pressed to count more that need more than one hand for the number of times I said the word affordable. And I think we really tried to the extent possible to talk about the number of jobs that get created. And some people would go, well, those are just construction jobs. But if you're a plumber, electrician, or a contractor, that's your permanent job. And you move from job to job. So we really talked about that. And then on the rental housing and the maintenance, those are additional jobs. So whenever we could, we really injected the jobs component, because we have a governor who is focused on three things: jobs, jobs, jobs. And so she was driving her message the whole time. And I think we just would, you know, kind of latch on to that this is part of a healthy economy. I do think what helped us a little bit in the northern part of the state, I know small, so we're almost all northern, Boston market is bursting at the seams, as you know, Chris. And there was every week every day I could find a story in the Boston Globe about how much further people had to go to find housing. So we did actually absorb some of that, which was a benefit, but also helped to drive up our prices. The other thing is, as we know, the highest number of young people are living with their parents since the 1940s. And I think here in Rhode Island, very close-knit communities, I think people were feeling that impact a little more. And so there seems to be a lot of interest, and when we would show the different types of housing. I think that was our constant thing, is showing that. And we definitely got a lot of questions. Oh, that? Is that what you mean? Are you going to build, like, you know, that was the most consistent. Like, what are you going to build? What do you mean?
I think Bob is correct. If you look at the slide that's on the screen now, we even decided to use the word homes as opposed to units. You know, we wanted you to know that it wasn't just a tenement that was going to go up in your neighborhood, as you mentioned or alluded to earlier, that these were real homes for real people, for real Rhode Islanders. So in addition to a jobs issue, which we know the state desperately needs, we also wanted to make sure that you understood these are homes that are built in your community. They're built by your local CDCs. They're built in accordance with local guidelines and regulations by the people who know your communities best. It's no one from the outside coming in to drive this agenda. It's driven by the people who are living right next to you, so they can support people who are just like you. And I think that resonated with most Rhode Islanders.
I would say there's a slide in there that shows it's got a bunch of stick pins. And so with the last two bonds, we could show where, this one, you could show that housing was built in most parts of the state. We had a little pushback in the northwest corner there, but it turned out if you dug deeper, it wasn't so much about the housing as it is about the proposed huge gas facilities that they want to build. So there was more concern about that. When we started to break it down and started saying income, we would say, well, this would be for a nursing assistant and a police officer. This would be for a medical secretary and a first-year teacher. And you start getting into that, I think that people were understanding it better. But it was, it was still hard at times.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate that, and I think it's a good, interesting lesson about how to take, in a sense, you talked about the Trump factor, that sort of populist message of the campaign, which was very much about jobs and people feeling somewhat left behind and challenged, and sort of turning that to a housing bond that didn't get stuck in the affordability kind of frame of what do you mean by that, and who are these folks, and what does it look like, and isn't that this kind of program, but sort of staying at that kind of job, and almost in sort of our paycheck to paycheck frame of the report we do, which is all about sort of jobs and wages, and taking advantage of the housing market pressures that people are feeling because of Boston in particular, but probably also Connecticut somewhat too on your other side.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues is, we have a growing minority community, which tends to be more in the urban core. But if you went back to that map, we did housing in lots of parts of the state. And so I think we were able to do away this image about those people, as repugnant as that is at times. We still had to deal with it. And I think we were able to show that in all of these communities, people were finding opportunities to find homes with the last bond. The one thing that was hard is I, at the beginning, really wanted to drive it as an infrastructure investment, bridges, roads, hospitals, schools, housing. But unfortunately, we had to sort of move away from that because there was a huge fight in our legislature. We got ranked the worst in the country, 50th, on roads and bridges, and the governor successfully pushed through something to fix that. So infrastructure, unfortunately, became a bit of a negative in our state, but I still think even when I hear the president speaking now, I like to think of housing as infrastructure. If you don't have that, we're going to build all the jobs and hopefully they'll come like they did to Boston, but then we'll be playing catch up on our infrastructure, on getting more housing built. So this is a chance to do it, we said, simultaneously as we try and pick up the pace of job creation or expansion in the state.
Yeah, I think for us, what we're particularly interested in learning about campaigns like yours that there were so many examples on election day of successful referendum or voting activities related to local, regional, or state level housing bonds or funding or trust funds or dedicated funding sources around the country in both traditionally kind of blue and red states. And so clearly there's a lot for us at the national level to learn from examples like your campaign, but also to figure out how do we translate that to discussions and a way to build political support for federal housing programs, which is the more complicated piece.
I mean, actually, I'm a little frustrated because we got the $50 million bond, and a lot of our legislators are saying, okay, we can't be doing bonds. It's not an effective way, back and forth. Meanwhile, Massachusetts is ending soon the use of the $1.4 billion, and I've been speaking to legislators there because we're trying to get them down to meet with our legislators to encourage them because we don't have a deep bench in our legislature. They're going to go after the senior senator on housing and Mass said, oh, it's a good time to talk because we're about to gear up for another bond. I said, really? I know I was involved when you got the $1.4 billion. I was up there. They're going to go for $1.7 billion this time. So it's a little daunting when we're here trying to, people not thinking it's a good way. But I keep saying for infrastructure, and if you think of housing as infrastructure, a bond might be the way to go depending on what's going on with your state budget. It's not the way to go for services, which could be driven too. But it's, it'll be interesting to see how Massachusetts unfolds, Chris, over the next 6 months or 3 months.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is how these are essentially PR campaigns about housing, and even though you all didn't feature the word affordability, you're still featuring the work you're doing, and whether that has some carryover effects into the kind of response people get when they actually bring these projects up or housing development efforts up for review. Is this create more education and support from a NIMBY opposition? How do we take the success on the buy-in of successful referendum like yours and sort of carry that into that kind of ongoing education and advocacy efforts that sometimes play out at the local level on zoning and land use, and other times play out at the federal level on what we're looking at ahead, which is the sort of funding for HUD and USDA's housing budgets.
I mean, one of the
But I
things
think-
we did as part of the campaign is we made some videos, and they're available online. We did a veteran. It was very powerful. But we also did one with a contractor and what it meant for him and his company, that he never had been in this space, and he has been, and what his commitment is to his employees and to the state of Rhode Island, that I think was uniquely powerful, an unusual voice to get heard, someone who benefits from this, but in a particular way.
Yeah, thanks.
We'll make sure to share the links in our notes to follow up since we couldn't show video through our webinar platform. I'm not seeing more questions come in, but thank you so much, Barbara and Kyle, for sharing this with us. This is a great presentation, and we will make the recording and the slides available to the whole task force, and just appreciate your time.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
In a challenging election season, we were happy to focus on this one.
Yeah,
Yes, it's a win that we're all happy about.
yeah, thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
So thanks everyone for joining us, and we will see you again in April 5th, I believe, and we've got great presentations lined up for you then. Steve Puntel with National Core Renaissance is going to talk about their work with redevelopment in San Bernardino with the public housing there, and Emily Faden and Kim Graziano from the Grounded Solution Network and Center for Community Progress are going to talk about some of their work around shared equity. So hopefully you will join us in April. Thanks everyone.